Welcome to Lecture 5, the Introduction to Environmental Science, Principles of Ecology, Natural Systems, and Biomes. And sometimes in the evenings it may seem a little warm where we are here in Florida, although sometimes it's not quite so warm. And this is a rainy afternoon, probably sometime in the fall or winter. Also in Florida, things change. So, what is this particular lecture about? It's about systems, ecosystems, of course, but the biosphere and how it also functions as an ecosphere. Positive and negative feedback loops. Those might not go in the direction you think they do in terms of impacts. Large-scale patterns of climatic variation is in global. Large-scale meaning more global. Temperature, atmospheric circulation, which is certainly a global thing, and precipitation, which may not seem global, but we'll see those global patterns. Talk about climate diagrams, just a tool that environmental scientists use to categorize and group these things we're going to call biomes when we get to that point. Soil. There are about 3 identified types of soil in Florida, in peninsular Florida. Other parts of the North American continent have many, many more types of soil, but we have 3. We'll talk about those in a minute. Terrestrial biomes, kind of the meat of this particular lecture. So, forests, you might gather that trees are the main component of forests. Plants define our biomes. Whether they're tropical rainforests, tropical dry forests, temperate forests, or boreal forests, which are cold forests. Also look at deserts, 3 flavors of those as well. The chaparral Mediterranean biome, which surprisingly enough is actually based upon the sort of environment you see around the Mediterranean Sea, but it occurs many places around the world. Grasslands, in terms of savanna, which is a tropical grassland. Prairie, temperate grassland, although extremes in temperature. And then tundra, which you may not think of as grassland, because isn't tundra just all snow? Mountains can go through this whole range. It can run from being a tropical environment to a temperate environment to a boreal environment to, well, tundra, if you will. So, the structure of natural systems. So, we're looking at the biosphere or the ecosphere in this case. A little definition there. Life-supporting portion. See if I get quotes in there. Yeah, there we go. Life-supporting portion of the Earth. The use of the biosphere is, give me 2 dots. I use my finger. There we go. That's still not working. You get the idea. A biosphere is a closed system. All materials are recycled and reused here in this planet. We're not getting a lot of material from outside. We're not shipping things in from asteroids. There's not a lot of cosmic dust providing us with nutrients or building blocks. It all happens here on the Earth. So, very closed system. Different idea. Humans often break these cycles at great risk. And I say stay tuned. Much later chapters we'll talk more about how we have interfered with, broken, if you will, these cycles. Biomes, terrestrial areas. Biomes are strictly terrestrial. They have distinctive climates, soils, and plant and animal characteristics. Now, biomes are more often defined by plants than they are by animals, but there are some characteristic organisms for both. Precipitation, how much it rains, temperature, those 2 things are the primary controlling factors in these biomes. You look at climates. We're going to talk about these 3 broad climates. A tropical climate includes a variety of biomes. Temperate climate, same way, and polar climate or that tundra climate. And then the categories of biomes. You can see that we're looking at, we could make a matrix out of this. This isn't math, don't worry, I'm not going to do that. But there are lots of combinations, variations across the globe for these sorts of things. Remember that we are actually in peninsular Florida, so things are a little different here. You knew that, didn't you? Systems. Talking about inputs, flows, and outputs. So what goes in, what flows through, and then what gets produced, puts out. So a system is a set of components that function and interact in some regular way. It includes, of course, ecosystems. Ecosystems have a set of components that do this. Get inputs from the environment, flows, throughputs through the environment, and then output, what goes back out to the environment. Systems respond to change through these ideas of feedback loops. In all systems, ecosystems respond to feedback loops as well. So what's a feedback loop? Let's look at that. Feedback loops. A positive feedback loop, you think, hey, that's going to be something that's positive. It's got to be good for the environment if it's a positive feedback loop, right? Well, it causes a system to change further in the same direction. For example, this is an actual picture, we'll see a close-up of it later, of the Hubbard Brook erosion experiment. Basically, the Hubbard Brook experimental forest in New Hampshire cut down a bunch of trees, and when they cut down those trees, the soil started eroding, and kept eroding, and kept eroding, and that's a positive feedback loop. It's one example. We'll talk more about that specific one here in just a moment. A negative feedback loop, you say, ooh, that can't be good. Well, guess what? Of course. It causes systems to change in the opposite direction from which it is moving. The opposite direction. So, think of something that is common in everyday life that does this, that changes the system in the opposite direction. Well, this is the greatest example. House thermostat. When the temperature, say it's winter time, and you have your thermostat set at, say, let's be conservative, 68 degrees, and the temperature drops below that point, but you want to stay at 68 degrees, what happens? The heat comes on. Heat comes on and it raises that temperature back up to 68 degrees, and then it shuts off. It causes the system, in this case the temperature in the room, to change in the opposite direction from which it is moving. Negative feedback loop. Important for environmental systems. So how do you carry out a controlled scientific experiment? Well, this is one way. You could be these folks, Borman lichens et al. In Hubbard Brook. It's good to have your own experimental forest, because you can do things like cut down all the trees and see what happens next. Well, they didn't just do that. They compared the loss of water and nutrients from the uncut forest. There we go, change colors. Uncut forest, control site, with a control site right there, with one that had been completely stripped of its trees, the experimental site. They did something that actually, in their experiments, the control group did not change in terms of the chosen response variables, soil, nutrients, and water. However, of course, the experimental group did. They found what we, environmental scientists, now take to be common knowledge. Trees keep that soil in place. They prevent erosion, prevent the nutrient loss from wetlands. So that was a a positive feedback loop. That slapped my hand. Large-scale patterns of climatic variation are something that we're going to look at next. I love this quote. This is, climate is what we expect, weather is what we get. From the famous 19th century meteorologist Samuel Clemens. You'll know him better as Mark Twain. Weather. I'm going to take care of that line I just drew through that. Let's get rid of that right there. Weather is the combination of temperature humidity, precipitation, wind, cloudiness, other atmospheric conditions occurring in a specific place and time. Remember the opening two slides, where the weather one night, it was very warm, 86 degrees, but then a day, say the next slide, it was cold and rainy. So it wasn't rainy when it was warm, but it was cold. Anyway, that's the weather that was happening at that particular time. You may have specific weather conditions that you're experiencing today before you've watched this video. Climate is that long-term average pattern of weather. So there you go. That's what Samuel Clemens is talking about. Climate is what we expect to experience. Weather is what we actually experience. So we can look at it from a local perspective. That first slide had a particular area. It was actually the town I live in. Regional, you could look at, in the case of peninsular Florida, what are the regional characteristics of climate changes? And then global climate change, a topic we will spend a fair amount of time on later. Earth's weather patterns, that distribution of rainfall, for example, is influenced by the sun. How much sun is actually, we talk about PAR and all that sun coming down, that heat and all that stuff in the last lecture. Solar radiation is intercepted by the Earth's atmosphere. The Earth's rotation and movement make a big difference in terms of how that heat is distributed. Prevailing winds and ocean currents make a big difference. So climate supports many different life forms. Three major types of climate we have. First of all, are tropical, nice and warm year-round. Temperate, where you have 4 seasons. I love that picture. You don't get very much of that around here. And then polarish. You don't get much of that around here. Really only 2 seasons. Extreme cold, and there is a cool summer. As in, not too hot. Into these climates fit these major terrestrial ecosystems. So you can see we have a combination. You can have tropical forest, you can have temperate forest, and you can have, well, polar forest, boreal forests. Same with grasslands, and same way with deserts. You wouldn't think you could have a cold desert, but we certainly have them. So how does the air circulate in the lower atmosphere? Well, the biggest part that we're going to look at here is this idea that the sun comes down stronger, is more intense at the equator almost all the time. The further north you go, we're about right here. We're at 27 degrees or so north of the equator. So we get more sun year-round than, say, somebody who lives way up here, and that's the Arctic Circle almost. So there's an uneven heating of the Earth's surface by the sun. The Earth's surface does not always get the same amount. Although the entire Earth's surface gets the same amount of sunlight over the course of a year, we'll talk about that in a different slide in a minute, it's uneven in terms of its heating. So what does that lead to? That rotation of the Earth's axis also plays a factor. That creates these prevailing winds. One of the things I want to kind of point out here is this band here, 30 degrees north. You see a similar band here at 30 degrees south, north and south latitude. Those are desert bands. There are deserts located primarily at those two areas. It's also fairly dry here at the north end and the south end, 60 degrees north and south. Have that same thing. In the middle, we have a tropical environment. Those are near the 10 degrees north or south of the equator is pretty much warm all the time and pretty wet. So let's look at the seasonality of this intercepted solar radiation. So, starting in the summertime, there's more sun, of course, striking most of the northern hemisphere because the southern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun. I'm going to write this 23.5 degrees. That is the latitude of the Tropic of Cancer, 23.5 degrees north. And what happens at the summer solstice on June the 20th is that the sun is directly overhead at 23.5 degrees in latitude. The further north you go, it's not as far overhead, but you're getting still more sunlight. The further north you go, the more sunlight you get. Until you get all the way to the North Pole, there are 24 hours of sunlight on June the 20th. As the Earth proceeds around the Sun in its orbit, you come to a point where we have the same amount of sunlight striking the Earth, or the same amount, the same day length. It's not the same amount because there's still more sunlight striking the equator. The same day length happens at the spring, vernal, and fall, autumnal equinoxes. Those are the 2 days of the year, if you will, when the day length is the same all over the world, approximately 12 hours and some minutes or something like that. I'm not sure exactly what that length is. And then as the the Earth proceeds to rotate on its axis and proceeds around its orbit around the Earth, proceeds in its orbit around the Sun. Say it right. At the winter solstice, once again, the Earth is tilted 23.5 degrees, but this time it's in the south latitudes that are getting direct sunlight. Tropic of Capricorn is located at 23.5 degrees in the south latitude. The sun's directly overhead. The tropics essentially stretch from 23.5 degrees north to 23.5 degrees south. Come on. There we go. So the Earth's orbit is not flat. It was hard for me to visualize this. I thought, well, the Earth wobbles. Well, it doesn't really wobble on its axis. Its orbit is tilted relative to the center line of the Sun, if you will. The equator of the Sun. Center line, equator. In fact, this is December 22nd. In the winter, during the winter solstice, the Sun is directly overhead at 23.5 degrees south. In January is when we're actually closest to the Sun. Yet in the northern hemisphere, it's when it's coldest. Why is that? Because the Earth is differentially warmed by the Sun striking it. So in the southern hemisphere, they're getting more sun, and we're getting less sun. As you move around, March 21st, back to that spring equinox, 12 hours a day of light. And then, actually, we are furthest from the Sun in July, when it's hottest in the northern hemisphere. But, once again, that's because we have a lot more sunlight striking us for longer during the day in the summer, if you will. So, equinoxes, solstice for the northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere. At the time, we experience opposite seasons. There's that 23.5 degree tilt again to the Earth's rotation. A little bit about climate and oceans. If you'll notice, these arrows in the southern hemisphere, they're always turning counterclockwise. No matter how you look, these are circulation arrows. Whether it be a cold current or a warm current, it's always turning counterclockwise. In the northern hemisphere, north of the equator, it's turning in a clockwise fashion. You'll notice that this Gulf Stream goes way up. It has a reach all the way up into Scandinavia, and that actually makes a big difference and influences the sorts of climate that we see up there. We'll see that in the climate diagrams a bit later. You can see the cold currents come down that west coast of Europe. Cold currents come down the west coast of North America. Quite cold, actually. If you like to go surfing, you go out to California, you think it's going to be nice and warm in the water, you'd be mistaken because it's pretty cold. Unlike the east coast of the United States where it's nice and warm. All right. Air also obviously circulates globally. If water circulates globally, air is going to circulate globally. So, atmosphere, constant state of movement, driven by rising and sinking air masses. So, as the air warms, it rises, warm air rises, cold air falls. Can't figure that out. Air heated in the equator, those equatorial regions 10 degrees north and south of the equator, goes to the top of the troposphere, which is approximately the top of where the biological activity is in around the Earth. As this air rises away from the Earth, as air rises, the pressure drops below it because you have less air. More air rises beneath and causes the air in the troposphere to spread out towards the north and south poles. Warm air holds more moisture than cold air, so that warm air rising at the equator carries moisture with it, and as it starts to fall, it actually dries out. And these are the bands. I got a picture of that. It's hard to see. I could scratch on that one too. But 30 degrees north and south of the equator are the primary areas where there are deserts, as is illustrated here. You can see that looking at a broader view of things, 30 degrees north, you have the Sahara. You have the 30 degrees south, you actually have, there's some very, very dry deserts here in Chile. And then you go 60 degrees north and you have another zone of desert, but that's not the sort of desert, there are no cacti growing up in northern Canada or the northern part of Siberia. And nor the same is also true down in Antarctica, which is almost always icebound. You can also see that around the equator you have quite a bit more precipitation coming down. Now there are regional changes to this. You'll notice that right there is Florida, and we have a fair amount of precipitation in Florida. Well, Florida is a peninsula. We receive a lot more rainfall than other parts of the world at 30 degrees, approximately 30 degrees north. Remember, we're between 25 and 28 degrees north of the equator. Looking at latitude and elevation. So, there's a similarity as you go from 0 degrees, which is the equator, 0 degrees is the equator, you go all the way up to, let's say, 60 degrees north. You go from tropical forest at the equator, deciduous forest, coniferous forest, and then you get tundra, and eventually you get to polar ice and snow. As you move north or south from the equator, once again the tropics are here, you get the same effect. Suppose you're at the equator, 0 degrees latitude, tropical rainforest. Then you go, as you move up in altitude, elevation if you will, you run into deciduous forest, coniferous forest, etc. The same sort of thing. You could just draw this line here down to deciduous forest and over to coniferous forest and tundra, etc. You see there's the same relationship with annual precipitation and temperature. As you increase in latitude, go from 0 degrees latitude to 60 degrees latitude, whether it's north or south. The same is true with elevation. You go from sea level up to, say, 10,000 feet. And I use K to represent 1,000 because I don't feel like drawing all those zeros. Topography makes a big difference also in terms of regional and local patterns of precipitation. This is a graphic, if you will, a warm ocean. Let's take a warm ocean. In this case, I know I said the Pacific wasn't warm earlier, but it's warm enough. Warm enough. So we have evaporation making that this warm air, it rises. As it rises, rain falls here on this forest. Let's call this Sierra Nevada. Trust me, that's what that says. And as that air cools, it's already dumped all of its moisture on this side, and on the arid side there's nothing left. So suppose you started over here in California, you have nice rainforest. You could say that's Washington State, whatever you want to call it. And over here on the arid side, let's call this Nevada, it's dry because of this idea that this mountainous topography influences local regional precipitation patterns. Rain shadow, that's what this essentially is a rain shadow on the leeward, that's a nautical term, but we're going to call it the downwind side of a mountain or a mountain range. That moisture is lost from the air as it travels up and over the mountains from the windward, the upwind side, windward side. So a little bit more about soils. Soil, complex. Now, you may not think we have very complex soils here in Florida. But it is, it's complex. It's a mixture of living and non-living materials. It's classified based upon vertical layering and those soil horizons. So we'll talk about soil horizons here in just a moment. Profile provides a snapshot of soil structure in a constant state of flux. You have that soil structure changing from the surface down to the bottom of the soil structure. Let's look at some soil horizons. The O horizon. Organic layer, freshly fallen organic matter. It is the top layers, it's most superficial, but it is where that organic stuff is. That's where the leaves fall, or whatever it is that's falling is right there. The A horizon is a mixture of minerals, clay, silt, sand, those things. The B horizon is below that. It's the material that is leached, as in rainwater carries it down, from the A horizon. This is where the plant roots are. And then the idea of the C horizon is the weathered parent material. This doesn't apply quite so well to Florida soils. Certain parts of Florida it does, but on the Lake Wales Ridge, which is where I'm lecturing from, our parent weathered material is very, very deep below ground. Usually soils are only considered in the top 72 inches or less of a soil of the land. To get to our parent material, you have to go down 1,000 feet. So it doesn't quite fit, but this is a classic view of a soil horizon. Very important in terms of biomes. So, soil horizon, this is just an illustration of it. The organic layer, the O layer, organic horizon. The A layer, mineral soil mixed with some organic matter, clay, all those things gradually being leached from the A horizon down into the B horizon, which is that depositional horizon. Minerals are leached from the A horizon, deposited in B. So you have minerals coming in down here, and you also have tree roots. And the C horizon in this case is actually that bedrock, if you will. Now, I said there are three soil types. There are three really considered in Highlands County, and this is a link to, if you're interested, soil survey of Highlands County. It's not required that you go look at it, but I think it's interesting. I hope you do too. Three soils. You might guess that the most predominant soil, if you look out in most of Florida, you would guess, raise your hand if you know the answer, is, of course, yes, sand. Very good. Yeah, okay, bear with me. The second most common, or the one that gets listed most common, actually is clay. Clay is present in Florida soils. That's not the word clay. Let's try that again. Oops, what happened there? Let's come back, come back. Oops, turn that back on. There we go. Found a new button. Very good. Now I want to erase that word. I do this all the time in the live class, so you're just getting a flavor of the live class. Isn't that great? Yeah. You'd rather not? Okay, heard that. Clay. The third type of soil is actually muck. Now, I learned in class that muck is also a current character in a game that's sweeping the globe. That's not what I'm talking about. This is organic soil. Muck is a type of soil type in Florida. Terrestrial biomes. Let's go through a list of biomes. So, biomes are terrestrial. They're only found on the land. We're only talking about the part of the Earth's surface that is above the waterline, that is not ocean. So, terrestrial. These are areas with distinctive climate, soil characteristics, plant and animal associations. Really, quite often, they are known almost exclusively by the plants they have. Talk about that in a minute. Distinguished predominantly by plants, I just said that. Associated with particular climates. So, this geographic seasonal variation in temperature and precipitation are very, very important to defining a terrestrial biome. Look briefly at climate diagrams. So, what they do gives you a snapshot of information about a particular area, a particular climate. Temperature is plotted on the left vertical axis. I have a graph of it, otherwise I'd draw here on the screen for you, but the graph is much better. Precipitation on the right vertical axis. 10 degrees centigrade change in temperature equals 20 millimeters of precipitation. Now, 20 millimeters of precipitation, what is that in terms of inches? It's about 8/10 of an inch of rain. So, every 10 degrees in temperature change, centigrade, is equal to about 8/10 of an inch of rain. The relative position of those lines reflect is water going to be available or not, which is fundamental to whether plants are going to be able to grow or not. Adequate moisture for plant growth only happens when precipitation is above the temperature line. Let's look at this example climate diagram. So, this is a classic, it doesn't have a location. First thing you'll notice is that in this case the temperature line is almost the precipitation line. And let me fix that. There we go. Get rid of that. Bring this back on. There we go. The precipitation line, right here, is almost always, well it is in this case, always above the temperature line. Again, temperature is over on this axis and our precipitation in millimeters is on this axis. Neutral color, there we go. In these times of the year, these months of the year, there's no shading that indicates that the mean and minimum temperature is below freezing, which means plants aren't going to grow very well. Same is true over here. So most of the plant growth that we're going to be interested in is going to happen during this period of time. Mean monthly temperature, given the left axis plotted with red dots. Mean monthly precipitation on the right axis has blue dots. It's a standard thing. It works. The other thing climate diagrams will include is an elevation, location, the mean annual temperature, and actually the mean annual precipitation. All that stuff is packed on this little graph. Interesting graph. Well, I think so. Let's look at the three major types of forests. We'll go back and look at climate diagrams in more detail in a moment. Tropical rainforest, clearly. What happens in tropical rainforest? Well, the temperature is almost the same year-round. Uniform temperature and abundant moisture. Plenty of rainfall. The thousands millimeters of rainfall. 1,000 millimeters is about 40 inches of rain. 2,000 millimeters, 80, you can do the math. Stratification, specialized plant and animal niches within height. One thing about tropical rainforests, any forest is going to be more three-dimensional, 3D. But tropical rainforests, they've got the market share, they got the corner on the market when it comes to vines and things like that growing up and down and around. Rapid recycling of nutrients. Rain dissolves nutrients. Nutrients have to be water soluble or else they would be useless to us and to all the other animals on the planet. So because it rains all the time, there has to be some way these plants have adapted to hold on to the nutrients. Temperate deciduous forest. Nice pretty colors there. You can see that there are moderate temperatures and moisture throughout the year. This is enough. Temperatures can be cold at times, but there's enough that there's growth pretty much year-round. Broadleaf trees lose their leaves and become dormant in the wintertime. Very slow rate of soil decomposition. There are these thick, slowly deepening soils. High nutrient content in that leaf litter. Those leaves do not give up their nutrients easily because that's what they're adapted to do. And then there's this idea of a boreal forest or coniferous forest, a taiga. Very cold at times, that line is freezing. A shorter growing season for those organisms. Coolest, coldest, and driest forests. quite a bit drier, quite a bit less rain, certainly than the tropical rainforest, and than any temperate deciduous forest. There are very few species of cone-bearing trees, because very few have adapted to this. Slow decomposition. The nutrients are bound up in that leaf litter. It's a very, I'm going to use the word recalcitrant. The leaf litter holds on to those nutrients quite tightly. Let's look closer at tropical rainforests. Beautiful picture. Yay. Most of these occur 10 degrees north or south of the equator. So when I say within 10 degrees latitude, it's not just north of the equator. Tropical rainforests are both north and south of the equator, and that's true for all of these biomes we talk about. There's very little temperature change over the course of a month, well, between months. From January to June, the temperature is going to be pretty much the same because they're so close to the equator. Annual rainfall is very large. 2,000 to 4,000 millimeters, that's 2 to 4 meters, that's 80 to 160 inches. It rains almost all the time in the tropical rainforest. Indeed, rainforests can create their own rain. That's how wet they are. And if there are any nutrients in the soil, all that rain quickly leaches them out of the soil. So plants have adapted ways of holding on to those nutrients. Organisms add this 3D aspect of things. You have vines going everywhere. You can go across. You don't have to walk. You don't have to go on the ground. You can go up high and around anyway. Three-dimensional. There are other biomes we'll talk about that are not three-dimensional. The thing about tropical rainforests is they are a source of staple foods, and we're discovering more and more medicines. Increasingly, we are exploiting the tropical rainforests. While tropical rainforests, well, they sort of still occupy 6% of the terrestrial part of the land surface. They hold 50% of all terrestrial species. The lion's share, absolutely most species on the Earth, in terms of terrestrial Earth, are found in tropical rainforests. The climate diagrams for tropical rainforests. If you look at Brazil, no surprise there. It's the temperature, you look across all of these, Brazil, Congo, and Malaysia, that temperature is pretty much the same, just below 30 degrees C, about 85 degrees year-round, almost day or night at times. You can see there is some variation in rainfall, but there's a lot of rainfall. There's almost a dry season here in Brazil. You don't see that in the Congo. You see a fair amount of steady rainfall there. And you certainly don't see that in Malaysia, where you have 2.6 meters of rain that fall. They're also all fairly close to sea level. 24 meters, 450 meters, that's not that high, and 27 meters, pretty close to sea level. Something you may not have considered or thought of or known about is this thing called a tropical dry forest, and this is actually in Costa Rica. And we'll look more at this in an assignment, but let's talk about it first. Usually located north and south, 10 degrees and 25 degrees, north and south latitude, north and south of that tropical rainforest. Climate is much more seasonal than in that tropical rainforest. So you actually have, though the temperature doesn't change very much, the rainfall does. Soils are richer in nutrients because you don't have a constant rain, but they are vulnerable to being eroded because sometimes things are steep there. They share many of the animal and plant species that are found in those tropical rainforests because the temperature is pretty much the same if a plant or an animal species can make that adaptation to a dry season. Very heavily settled by humans. It's again, good soils. Where's that soil thing at? Good for agriculture. One of those things that we're going to talk a lot more about, so I highlighted right there, fire is important for the maintenance of tropical dry forests. Without fire, you think fire is bad. Well, fire is very important to maintenance of most forests, and tropical dry forests is certainly true. Not so much the tropical rainforest, but tropical dry forest, certainly fire is important. So what, a little more detail. They experience extremes in rainfall. We'll look at this when we get to the climate diagrams. And so a lot of variation in rainfall. Temperatures are constant year-round. Again, we'll see that when we get to the climate diagram. Relatively fertile soil, agriculture. This is kind of where the rubber meets the road for tropical dry forests. 10 times more human beings than in the rainforest. Here's the number of people. This is populations, and this is a type of forest. So in the rainforest, there aren't that many people, same way with the wet forest. When you get into the moist to the dry forest, the population swells. And this has actually led to the destruction of those intact tropical dry forests. So the climate diagram for a tropical dry forest, series of tropical dry forests. Thing you'll see right away is that this the red line, the temperature line, is well above the precipitation line in all three of these examples. And I'll talk about this last one here in a moment. But in this case, where's this, Acapulco? Yeah, Acapulco. Big difference, big change in terms of rainfall. There's a very strong rainy season. Gosh, that sounds familiar. We have a very strong rainy season here in Florida too, but we're not quite that tropical. Even more in Bombay, they have a thing called the monsoon. And believe me, May comes, they're ready for that monsoon because the temperature gets quite hot, quite a bit hotter than you would expect in that part of India. In this case, this is in Darwin, Australia, and that is south of the equator. And for those climate diagrams south of the equator, you'll notice that the diagram starts in July, these others start in January, and ends in June. Well, that's because this is summertime. Summertime being November, December, January, February time frame, so that you can compare one climate diagram to another. Once again, the same thing, very, very strong rainy season, no real growth during these dry season periods. Let's look at a temperate old-growth forest. The majority of them lie north of the tropical dry forests, and even north of the deserts. Talked about deserts earlier. Majority between 40 and 50 degrees north and south latitude, and we're talking about both north and south of the equator. Rainfall averages from 650 to 3 meters, if you will. That's a fair amount of rain. Just kind of, there are places where you get a lot more rain than other places. Very fertile soils, but those fertile soils, long growing seasons. Oh, this is in the warm. Let's talk about soils. That is, okay, that's the word warm, trust me. In colder deciduous forests, they're dominated by conifers, where you're tending or trending up towards the boreal forest, but you're not quite there yet. Biomass production can be very high. These areas can grow very quickly because they have fairly long growing seasons. Most major human population centers, name a big city in the world, and it's likely located in a temperate forest. Moscow, Paris, New York, Chicago, the big cities. Los Angeles, not quite so much. That's Mediterranean. Dallas, don't know why. But Atlanta, there you go. They were all built in temperate forests, largely because it was a temperature regime that benefited us, and there were abundant supplies to build these cities. So looking at these climate diagrams, it's one example. This happens to come from Oregon. There is a distinctive wet and dry season. You can see that here in the middle of summer in Oregon, I don't know exactly where that forest is, there is a distinctly dry period. So the growth actually is happening in the winter because, well, there's some cold season. There's less of it than you might expect. Philadelphia, cold season, although you still have abundant rainfall throughout the year, and this temperature change. And then in France, less rainfall and less extreme temperature, but you still have these seasons, these months of the year when the average temperature is below freezing. Average low temperature is below freezing. So let's look at a really cold forest. This is the boreal forest, also known as the taiga. Confined, and I say primarily, to the northern hemisphere. If you look at the southern hemisphere, this is 50 to 60 degrees north and south of the equator. North of the equator, in the northern hemisphere, there's actually land there. South of the equator, well, it's mostly ocean. So primarily confined to the northern hemisphere, although you do have some boreal forests, say, in the southern part of South America. There's certainly some, fair amount, I gather, in New Zealand. Quite dramatic, in fact. It covers 11% of the Earth's land area. That's a lot. Twice as much as the tropical rainforest, or almost twice as much. Very thin acidic soils, very low in fertility. Generally, there's a lot of evergreen conifers located in this area. Lots of animals, big animals, reindeer, caribou, those sorts of things that tend to be fairly well adapted and tend to do well in these areas. Historically, we haven't really intruded very much, although we certainly have been in the boreal forest. We prefer it a little bit warmer, quite a bit warmer. Fire sometimes plays a role. Fire is increasingly playing a role as we see increasing droughts and the increasing temperatures during the summertime in these boreal forests. Fire can have devastating impacts on boreal forests because they grow so slowly. So let's look at the climate diagram for a boreal forest. First thing to notice is, in this particular place is Dawson, Canada, that the growing season is very short, so you really don't have any growth here. Throughout, you see that the rainfall is above the temperature graph, but the same is true in Sweden. Although in Sweden, here's that the influence of the Gulf Stream. In Sweden, you have, it's warmer, not nearly as cold, although that's still plenty cold, and you have more rainfall. That Gulf Stream is carrying that warm water from basically the eastern portion of North America all the way up here. It makes a big influence on what goes on in terms of the climate in Ireland and Scotland and all the way up to Sweden. So the growing season is still limited, although it's certainly longer when you get over here into Russia. Very short growing season, very cold during these periods of time. And let's talk about the desert. We already said that most of the desert lies between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator. It occupies 20% of the Earth's land surface. Now remember, the tropical rainforest, TRF, has 6%. The boreal forest has 11%. Approximately. So deserts have far more of the Earth's land surface. You add that up and there's a lot of land surface that is desert, and there are indications that maybe this is increasing some, although it's not that fast. In the case of deserts, water loss almost always exceeds precipitation, so growing season is very, very rugged, very tough. Soil, extremely low in organic matter. We think of it as being sand for the most part, although there's plenty of not sand soil, but it's just very, very dry and hard. Plant cover can be sparse or not present at all. There aren't a lot of animals. We talked about there being a lot of animals in the boreal forest, but not in deserts. However, this idea of biodiversity, more biodiversity is better. High biodiversity is a good thing. Biodiversity in the desert may be high because animals are adapted to this extreme environment, and they have very, very narrow niches. And you'll hear me talk about niches before, well, you've heard me talk about them before, and you will hear me talk about them again in a later chapter. very strong adaptations, behavioral adaptations. They know how to avoid the heat of the day. Find a rock to crawl under. Well, that's one way. We are definitely increasing our intrusion, particularly since we figured out how to make the desert bloom. This is, you hear this, the desert bloom. Well, the way we do that is by pulling water from places that didn't used to provide water to the desert, like underground. Or in the case of the Colorado River, it's a huge source of water for the desert in the desert southwest, although it's about to be used up. So, 3 major types of deserts, you might gather. This is a very hot desert. Tropical desert, hot and dry most of the year. You get the big old sand dune there, you get the buggy, that's classic desert. Temperate deserts, this is actually a more common form of desert. Extreme range of temperatures, daytime high temperatures, but you can also be very cold at night in these particular deserts. This is actually more what you see in Arizona. And then there are actually cold deserts. Mongolia is a cold desert. All of these, very fragile ecosystems. Slow plant growth, limited water, plenty of sunlight though, but nutrients are hard to come by. Low species diversity in places, but you can have very strong adaptations. Very slow nutrient recycling because the nutrients, well, they're hard to come by in the first place, and organisms they don't let go of them very easily. And this thing ties them all together. Lack of water unifies the whole thing. Come on, there we go. So, deserts. I mean, in all of these, you see that the temperature line is, well, okay, except for that one. The temperature line is above the precipitation line, well above it, certainly in Yuma and in Chad. But this is a cold desert. There are other cold deserts. There's actually a cold desert up here in the Pacific Northwest. You think of that, oh, it's all nice and rainy all the time. Not if you go east of the Cascade Mountains, then you get into the desert. Same thing is true here in Mongolia, where sure there's enough rainfall, or no, not rainfall, precipitation. Note the temperature here is 20 degrees below zero centigrade, average. Okay, it's cold in the wintertime in Mongolia, and that's when the precipitation falls. And when precipitation is not falling, so it's very, very limited in terms of the amount of growth you can get in a cold desert. Same is true in Spokane, I believe, is the city on the eastern edge of Washington. It's so very dry and cold. Mediterranean woodland and shrubland. Kind of a pretty picture. And that's a classic hillside showing some nice shrubs. Occur in all continents except Antarctica. Climate is very cool and moist in the fall, very pleasant time. Oh, in the winter, in the spring. I can read the rest of the sentence. Most of the year, people like living in the Mediterranean. That's why people like living in the Mediterranean. California, many, many places have this very preferred climate. The Baltic, not the Baltic, the Black Sea, sorry, Baltic's a little cold. Can be very hot and dry in the summer. That dryness is very important. People like to live here. I've said that. It's going to come back. Very fragile soils, though they can be fertile. This is where we grow olives, where we grow a lot of grapes. Many of the foodstuffs that we developed, a lot of the grains and all those things, were developed here because there is a fair amount of fertility and the growing season is fairly long. Trees and shrubs are typically evergreen. Well, fire-resistant plants. Fire is very, very important to the maintenance of the Mediterranean woodland and shrubland. I'll say this, and I'll say this many times in the future, you'll hear it. If a forest has developed to burn, it will burn. If you suppress that forest from burning over time, it'll find a way to burn because it'll build up enough fuel. That's certainly true in the Mediterranean environment. And there are places in North America where we suppress fire. California is a major place for that. A lot of people live there, can't have fire in houses, but it causes bigger fires. long history of human intrusion. We have been a part of the Mediterranean woodland and shrubland almost throughout human history. Much of it has been cleared for agriculture. All right, go back and make that point. Fire regime, it's important. So, notice that for all of these, and we have San Diego, Italy, and Australia, Adelaide, Australia. All of these, the growing season, the temperature is above freezing for the whole year. However, in all of these, significant amount of growth isn't going to happen in the summertime in San Diego because it's too dry. There's just no rainfall. The temperature's not that bad. Certainly true in Toronto, although it's a little bit less intense. And though it's backwards in Adelaide, this is still their summertime, no growth is going to happen there because the temperature is above the precipitation line in this case. Let's look at grasslands. 3 different types. Tropical savanna, warm year-round. Maintained by herds of grazing antelope. Think impala, think wildebeests, things like that. Grazing animals are very important to the maintenance of all these grasslands. Scattered clumps of trees, they do assist with the specialized browsing habits. For example, giraffes, they eat the tops out of trees, and that's one of their browsing habits. It limits the growth of trees. There are alternating wet and dry seasons, we'll see. Fire does play a role in suppressing the growth of some tree species. Temperate prairie, extreme seasonal temperature swings. The prairie can go from boiling hot in the summer, well over 100 degrees if you're in the Fahrenheit scale, commonly in the Great Plains part of the United States, to well below freezing, 20 or 30 degrees below zero freezing in the wintertime. Extreme seasonal temperature swings. Grass accumulates deep, rich soils. That's why we love it, because the tall grass, short grass prairies, maintained by fire, but the prairie is essentially the world's breadbasket. It's heavily farmed. It's where we get almost all of our breadstuffs. Corn, wheat, barley, you name it, it likely comes, sorghum, comes primarily from the prairie, not just in the United States. There's a tremendous prairie that extends throughout from the Ural Mountains all the way to the east in Asia. Huge prairie. The third type is the cold grassland. It is grassland, though it's frozen for most of the year. The majority of the year, put it that way. This idea of permafrost. Permafrost is also an important part of the boreal forest. That's why fires in the boreal forest are so very damaging. But permafrost, and we'll see this in later lectures, keeps that summer melt from seeping into the groundwater, and that provides these shallow wetlands teeming with life during the summer. Many migratory bird species do their nesting, their breeding up in the Arctic tundra because there's tremendous amounts of food available up there, and that's what they've adapted to do. Talk about that in a second. So, let's look at the savanna first. Tropical savanna. Nice giraffes there. Those grazing ungulates. Occur north and south of the tropical dry forest. 10 to 20 degrees of the equator. Tropical rainforest too. There are things that maintain this tropical grassland. Climate alternates between wet and dry season, very similar to that tropical dry forest. Droughts associated with the dry season often lead to these natural wildfires that naturally are able to, they burn trees, yeah, they burn grass, but grass recovers very quickly from that. Soils can have a very low water permeability. Why is that important? Well, trees typically don't like to have, use the term wet feet. The root systems in most trees are not adapted to being continuously flooded. And if that water's going to stand there, the grasses do much better. Those saturated soils keep the trees from growing, not completely out, but certainly reduces their growth. Landscape is much more two-dimensional. Remember we talked about forests, particularly tropical rainforests, being three-dimensional. Two-dimensional almost always, it's flat, it's grassland. Of course, it's only going to be pretty much two dimensions. Increasing pressure to produce livestock in these areas. Good soils. So here's the climate diagram for tropical savanna. You can see there's extreme, the tropics, again, nice, the temperature is pretty much the same all year round. But the growing season in Venezuela, quite a bit wetter, but it's still limited in the dry season. Same is true in Niger, much more limited. You do have a relatively short rainy season, and much more so in Long Reach, Australia, where though the temperature is not quite as extreme, not quite as hot or cold, you do have a limitation on the growing season in that tropical savanna environment. Temperate grasslands. Beautiful prairie right there. Extremely widespread in their distribution. They're all over the earth. Annual rainfall has a very wide range, from 300 millimeters, 0.3 meters, to 1,000 millimeters, about 40 inches of rain a year in some of these areas. Or precipitation, it's not all rain. Periodically they go through droughts. The soils tend to be extremely nutrient deep and extremely rich. And that's part of the reason why we are able to grow crops here so well, because they are so deep and rich. Thoroughly dominated by grass. Imagine that. It's grassland. Herbaceous vegetation. But what maintains that in many of these temperate grasslands? The same thing that maintains it actually in the savanna. Bison, cattle, anything that's going to eat a lot of grass. Roaming ungulates, buffalo if you will. Ungulates the same, has 4 stomachs and all that. The temperature diagrams for grasslands. If you look in Manhattan, Kansas, frozen parts of the year, so there's not a lot of growth here, but the rest of the time there's abundant moisture for plenty of grass growth. Same is true, this is in Russia, where you can see that the temperature is much more extreme and there's less precipitation. Over in China, sort of the same story, except the temperatures, the growing season is longer, but there's less precipitation. In fact, parts of the spring, you can't grow things because it's too warm, not enough rainfall. During the summer, things probably grow pretty well. But you can see how extensive that breadbasket is there from Eastern Europe all the way into Central Asia. There's also some temperate grasslands in South America, and I think there's probably some down in the other parts of the southern hemisphere. Tundra. Clearly that's tundra. Look how white that is. Wow. That's a barren snowstorm. That's not tundra. That's tundra. Tundra covers most of the land north of the Arctic Circle. Tundra, remember, it's a grassland, so there's got to be some grass in it. Climate is typically cool and dry when it does have a growing season. Of course, the rest of the year it's really cold. It's actually a desert. 200 to 600 millimeters of precipitation, not a whole lot of precipitation. Most of that is frozen, so you have to wait on the snow melt. Very low decomposition rates. Things are frozen most of the year, and things just simply don't decompose if they're frozen. Supports a lot of native animals, mammals. Grazers come in and actually live off that grass. Human intrusion is historically low, but it's increasing. As resources become scarce in other places, we are actually moving to the tundra and doing a lot of mining, oil exploration, those sorts of things in the tundra. Climate diagram for the tundra. You can see that Point Barrow, Alaska, very short growing season, like 2 months. It's already, if you miss it in July and August, you've missed it because it's just so cold. The same is, well, it's not quite as extreme in Norway. Once again, we have a little bit of impact still Not as, it's not quite as cold because of this Gulf Stream influence, but it's plenty cold here in this part of eastern Russia, where you have no growth for, except for those 2 months. So tundra, very limited in terms of its growth. Let's look at some mountains, some mountain ideas. We talked about latitude and elevation being very similar. So mountains are built extensively by these geological processes concentrated in belts of geologic activity where tectonic plates collide. We'll talk much more about tectonic plates in a later chapter. If you're interested in kind of a preface of that, you might investigate the logo. Our logo actually is based upon a map of tectonic plates, and you can find more information about that on our D2L homepage. I think it's still up. If it's not, well, when I finish recording this lecture, I'll put it back up, make it available. Anyway, geologic processes, mountains are where there's plenty of geological activity. Climate changes with elevation. As you move up the mountain, it gets colder. So you have different sort of vegetation down here and what you have up here. Same way with animals live there. And as you move from the equator up to the north or down to the south, the climate also changes. Soils are well drained. Yeah, rock drains pretty well, and the soils are almost always very thin. Flora and fauna, same is true. Flora and fauna change with elevation. Historically, this is where we do our mining. We get our coal, we get our iron ore, we get our copper, we get our uranium, pick a metal, and this is where we get it from because this is where the Earth's crust is more exposed. This is kind of an outline of where those mountains are. You notice in the the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, they're aligned, the big mountain ranges run north and south, and that's where those tectonic plates are. Generally, although it's not as clear cut, in Asia and Europe, you have east-west running mountain ranges, and that's the Himalayas, are classic, where you have this uplift as this Indian tectonic plate pushes up against the Asia one. And then there's this thing we'll talk about later called the Ring of Fire that's sort of encompassed in, you see there are very large mountains in parts of Indonesia, certainly Japan, lots of volcanic activity here. We'll talk more about this in a later unit. Summary. Wow. We go on forever. So we talked about systems, the biosphere, and the ecosphere, kind of where we're able to live. We have positive and negative feedback loops. Positive feedback loop example is where in the Hubbard-Brook experimental forest, cut down the trees and the erosion just continued. There was, unless you let the trees grow back, that erosion is going to continue. You have a positive feedback loop. It's something that continues to change the system in the same direction. A negative feedback loop is where you have let me get back to that. There we go. Negative feedback loop is where you have there we go. Back down to feedback loops. There we go. Negative feedback loop is where you actually have the system changing one direction, and the feedback loop will turn it and put it back in the other, reverse the direction the system's moving in. A house thermostat is a classic example of a negative feedback loop. Talk about large-scale patterns of climatic variation, how climate is what we expect and weather is what we get, from Samuel Clemens. The temperature, atmospheric circulation, and precipitation on a large scale, a global perspective. Looked at climate diagrams, went through several of those. Hope you have an idea of what those are about now. Talk about soils, and we have sand, clay, and muck soils in this part of Florida. Other parts of the world have many, many more types, but those are the foundations of our terrestrial biomes. And then we talked about terrestrial biomes. Yeah. We talked about tropical rainforest, tropical dry forest, and tropical grasslands. This isn't the same order as I took them in, but hey, you can figure it out. But the deserts, now you have hot deserts, tropical deserts, temperate deserts, most commonly thought of deserts, and you can have cold deserts. And actually, you get to the tundra and it's really a desert too. And then chaparral, Mediterranean environment, biome. Temperate forests and temperate grasslands, where the temperature can vary a great deal over the course of a year. Boreal forests, pretty much cold, very short growing season. And then the tundra, where you have very, very short growing seasons. So looked at mountains and how they affect biomes. You can have one biome, a whole series of biomes if you go up a mountain. Particularly at the equator, you can have tropical rainforest at the base, and you can have tundra at the top of the mountain. The assignment. This is a Guanacaste tree. This researcher studied the natural history of tropical dry forests in Costa Rica, looking at restoration efforts. Remember I said that tropical dry forests are highly threatened. Guanacaste tree has no current dependable dispersers. We have things that look a lot like Guanacaste trees. It may be another version of this tree. We call them elephant ear trees. But anyway, no current dependable dispersers of its seeds. Trees produce tremendous numbers of fruit. If they're anything like the elephant ear trees I used to have in the house I lived in, they're impossible to get rid of. Oh, what a nuisance. Anyway, I digress. The last native dispersers, the things that actually would allow these trees, because they're a big part of the tropical dry forest, they went extinct 10,000 years ago, a long time. Certainly wasn't something that we necessarily were directly involved in, although maybe we ate them. Cattle and horses, which are exotics, introduced exotics, are the dispersers for the Guanacaste trees. For example, you have Guanacaste seed. Historically, this little guy, this camel, it's extinct, but it used to be the disperser. Now horses are the dispersers. Basically, these seeds are consumed by the horse, pass through its gut, and then fertilized when the horse does its thing. Here are the references. You can see most everything that was presented in this talk in these references. Dan Lucheras, Miller and Spoolman, Moles, and Smith and Smith. And I leave you with a nice image of a tropical rainforest. Very soothing, isn't it?